Jesus, we are the soldiers of the light. We don't rest on flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. In our hearts we have a vision. We have made our decision to show the Father's love with great power from above. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't rest on flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Let us reach this generation, every tribe and every nation, for we've overcome the world by the blood of Christ the Lamb. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't rest on flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and power. Lord our God is a sword and the rock of faith. In Jesus Christ, we are the soldiers of the light. We don't rest on flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. The Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and power. Lord our God is a sword and the rock of faith. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't rest on flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty.
Good morning. If you guys learned nothing from me a month ago, you know I have a lot to say and a lot to get through, so I'm going to start right away. I am Missy Berg. I am kind of closing out this 8 weeks of guarding our hearts and our families. This week we are going to talk about mental health. But as promised, for you guys at home and here, I talked way too much a month ago about that technology piece, and I said we would revisit it. So to start this morning, I just kind of want to start with 2 questions for you. When we talked about that tech piece, question number 1, anything you guys have tried, anything that's going well for you, or not going well for you? Has anybody made any changes on your own? Doesn't have to be the advice I gave, but any changes you guys are trying out there? Yeah.
We did. I canned the tablets in the car. Like, we were already starting to do that before the talk, and after that, we just did it for anything less than 30 minutes. And they really didn't protest. They were just kind of like, okay.
Right? And I think that's what we find. The more we set these, they do other things.
They do fight. This beautiful, oh, now they're entertaining themselves. It's great. They all beating each other up.
That became strategy in our who you put the furthest back and not by anybody else was going to be that instigator. Just for each other. Absolutely. But that's one of our fondest memories too, you know, with your siblings. I know I'm not picking you guys just because you said this, well, you probably shouldn't be telling kids, but you might be given the phones this year, and so one of the things you guys were looking into is more of that expectation, what I used to call contract. And we talked about some resources there. Anybody else try anything?
I don't necessarily try anything, but I've noticed I'm more aware of my being passive, and I'll be at home on the couch and the kids will be playing, and I'll be like, oh, I'm being passive, and I'll go play. Or I'll even be like, hey, you're being passive. So just that whole passive thing stuck with me. And I would say we have been more like on a Saturday afternoon trying to get the kids to do less screens for sure, stuff like that.
No, that passive thing stuck out for me too, and that became really why when I'm at home, my cell phone stays on that kitchen counter, because it is just well, it's there, why not? And you don't always realize it. Yep. Yeah.
I've also done the leave the room thing when I'm trying to draft something, and I realize how often my kids will talk to me extra when I'm doing that because they're trying to get my attention. And so I was like, hey, I'm gonna walk out and then come back, and then they were like, oh, all right. So I would have never thought to do that before. In the past, I was always like, give me 10 minutes, give me 10, that kind of thing.
And I love that because twofold. One, you're teaching them this spot in this room or wherever you're leaving to is going to be my work or get this done, or even if it's social media, this is where I'm going to be on with this. Later, they're going to want to adapt that for school and all of those things. But two, you're also so aware of how often am I doing this, whether it's work or social media, and that helps too for you to get back to your family. So, good. And thanks for sharing. Anything that was still, I encourage you guys on your bulletin to write notes or questions or anything you guys want to revisit, anything you want to challenge me on or have that discussion of, hey, did you think about this? Questions, comments, anything from that tech week. Okay. I leave here and I continue to think about it, maybe not you guys, so I just wanted to check in on that. This week we are talking about mental health. And I want to start with those statistics that you guys have all heard. One, we know that this generation has the highest levels of depression, anxiety, and risk of suicide than any generation before them. This came out of research from Jean Twenge, which I will refer to again later. But that's very startling for us. And also, the very concerning for me was the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2019 shared that in 2019, mental health diagnosis for children and adolescents actually surpassed physical conditions as the most common issues causing impairments and limitations for kids and parents. So we've got, okay, this woman who set out to do research on mental health, but we also have pediatrics who's saying, oh my gosh, coming into our office is more often mental health than these physical conditions. So you guys have heard this. We know that. Hopefully that's part of why you're here today. Why? What do you guys think? What are some of the things going on that make these statistics where they are? Loaded question.
I think lack of real communication, just in general, but I would say with loved ones, and by real communication, I mean what we're doing right now with our voices and, giving hugs rather than texting back and forth, I think that, I don't know, I would estimate more than 50% of the communication that my students have with their parents, and I'm not kidding, is via the phone. you know, and mostly texting rather than on the phone, like calling, which is wild.
Yes. Yeah.
Public schools teaching things other than what they should be.
Do you want to be any more specific or no?
The LGBT thing and all that.
Okay.
I think it's
Transgender.
searching for other means to find satisfaction. Anything outside of God, it's all about yourself. And eventually, you're just not going to be satisfied.
I'm gonna kick in from the other angle. I think we have more awareness, acceptance, research, and exploration of it.
And just to piggyback, I was gonna say, we're actually better at diagnosing it than we were 20 years ago by far.
Yes.
And I think those last two are so important. You know, when we look at research, we actually are researching this. But two, that awareness and acceptance, it's okay to talk about it. Where would those numbers have been years ago when we didn't have all these things? Absolutely. Yeah.
I think some of the like the social media things have made the kids a lot more inward thinking versus outward thinking.
I agree with all of those. For me, I'm going to kind of break this into 3 areas of which actually will encompass all of these things. One, I want to just start with emotions. We're going to have a conversation about what an emotion is, how we get in a better practice of naming it properly, but also how they are fundamentally functional and what we can do with them. Then we're going to get back to that tech piece. A little bit of it is a review, but I want to go more in depth about how technology is affecting these 3 C's. And communication is one of them, that connection, and then coping. And then lastly, we'll kind of talk about the roles of parenting, and I'm going to go so broad as to say adults in our kids' life and kind of some of the decisions we're making. As always, I'm going to talk about the concern, but I promise when you leave here, it's more about what we can tweak and what we can do differently. So let's start with emotions. For emotions, you know, I work in a public high school, and every day kids are coming in distress, and I think my mental health background, I have more of an open door of, hey, I'm feeling this today, Mrs. Berg. So distress-wise, emotions, feelings, what do you guys think are the 2 most common emotions a kid will come in and tell me they're feeling?
Anxious.
Anxiety?
Stress. Or that might fall on anxiety.
Yeah, but we're going to go there. That's sad. But what do you think they call it? Depression. So our kids come in, and on a daily basis, I'm having a conversation with Mrs. Berg, I'm feeling depressed, and Mrs. Berg, I'm feeling anxious. 2 big buzzwords out there. So I want to start with depression. The first thing I do for kids is remind them depression is not an emotion. And we need to remember that as adults in their lives. I was just talking to my son Autumn yesterday, and he likes to look at the weather, and he's like, oh my gosh, today, you know, tomorrow's going to be sunny, but the rest of the week is going to be cloudy. That makes me depressed. Okay, my kids now roll their eyes at me, but I said, no, it doesn't make me depressed. Let's have this conversation. But to that point, how often as adults in their lives, my mom made this comment over Thanksgiving, blah, 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 I'm feeling depressed. No, depression is not an emotion. We need to remove that from our vocabulary for kids. What could they be feeling if they said, Mrs. Berg, I'm feeling depressed? What might they be feeling? What are some other synonyms for that? Sad? Disappointed? We need to get back on some of the ones that I came up with: sad, heartache, sorrow, hopeless, despondent, unhappy, disappointed. We need to get back of kind of vocabulary-wise renaming that emotion to something that's going to be very specific about how they are feeling. But really important is us too not using I'm feeling depressed. Depressed is an impairment, it's a disability, it is not an emotion. So now anxiety. Your kid comes and says, Mom, I'm feeling anxious about this. Anxiety, another buzzword, first thing I tell kids, it is an emotion, but yet we all treat it like it is only a disability. That's important semantics too. Everybody has anxiety in them. Let's normalize, yeah, you are feeling anxious, you are feeling stressed. What are some other words that would be synonyms for anxiety? I'm feeling anxious, feeling stressed, I'm feeling scared, worried, nervous. Yes, so same thing. The first thing I do with students is rename it a synonym that's more specific about how you are feeling. I always say it's the power in that name. But depression, let's get back to the reminder, it is not an emotion, it's an impairment. Anxiety is an impairment, but it's also an emotion. It's in there, it's in all of us. How could we do this? How do we help our kids expand their vocabulary, rename these things? From a very young age, look at books and movies. We were just talking about movies and hey, do you want to watch this? Because this is some of the stuff that's going to come up. Think about characters. From a very young age, start to talk about how might that person be feeling right now. And use synonyms, other broader vocabulary for our kids to get back to the 23 different categories of emotions. Yet, as a generation, we use like 5 to 10 of them. Another thing you can do, which I think is really important, is that synonym. So if they tend to use or gravitate to these buzzwords, reflect yourself how often you're using them, but say, what do you mean? What does that feel like to you to get them comfortable talking about that? And then the last thing, share yourself. You know, what's so important is talking about, like even me getting ready for this, I get nervous every time I go talk in front of people. And sharing with your kids those emotions and how you're feeling as you go into those things. Next up, remind them all emotions are useful. So this is probably my favorite one because as a generation, we kind of got in that bad habit of, because it's uncomfortable, it's to be avoided. And that's the worst thing we can do. One of the first statements I always make to students is emotions are fundamentally functional. They have a purpose in our bodies. Start there. Once we start there, remind them emotions are to be worked with, not avoided. And I always say it's kind of like that little alarm system going off to say, hey, pay attention to me right now. When you do that, anybody see the movie Inside Out? Okay, what was the premise? Like, what was the moral or the whole purpose of Inside Out?
Well, there's 4 different instances: sadness, like joy, and anger. And it was just kind of cool that like she had these balls, and each one represented an emotion. So there was like this huge factory, and when that emotion came out, it kind of showed like, you know, she had a happy memory, so a yellow ball. So it's kind of just a visual to see like all the emotions, and I don't know.
Yeah, so there's all these different emotions. You did it beautifully. And then what was the end moral of the story? Do you guys remember? So Riley, the little girl, had to move away. Yeah.
So Joy kept trying to make all of the memories happy, and then she realized that they could like exist together, and some memories could be happy, sad, and there was like nuances to things. They weren't all black and white, and that was okay.
So it was one of those movies that when it came out, a lot of people were like, ugh. Of course I loved it because Joy was trying to squash all these other emotions that might feel uncomfortable to little Riley. Yet, in the end, if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, in the end, when Joy is looking at Riley and all of these trouble, stressful times in her life, what came out of that? She was with people she loved. All of these positive things came from it. So there's a research study done, and they asked Americans, what was your worst moment in your life? And then they reflected on that. And then they also asked Americans, what was your best moment? And over half of the participants said, my worst moment was also my best. Why? What happens in our worst moments? Grow, right? Grow, learn, adapt. Again, back to family and some of those supports. Laura Gilliland, week 2, and the handouts are still out there, she gave out a handout that said, you don't have to hang on, it's okay to fall. I don't know if any of you guys read that, or again, it is over here. But the message paraphrase of Matthew 5:3, it said, you're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God in his rule. It's the same for our kids. Something comes into play for us as adults that we feel like, oh, I don't want my kid to feel this emotion, because again, it's uncomfortable. Maybe it's not pleasant for them. But this is a good reminder of, in those times, emotions are just letting them know how they feel. When we are sad about something, the good news, we care. That's a good thing. If we're feeling stressed, overwhelmed, anxious, maybe we need to look at that. Again, emotions are just baby alarms saying, pay attention to me. There's something we need to do right now. When our kids come to us with that intense emotion, remind them they're fundamentally functional. Once they identify that emotion, this is one that's really tough as a parent. We've got to remember that physiological responses our body has when we're feeling that emotional are useful to us. So when they come and they're feeling, let's say it's tears, let's say you can see the anxiety, they're just a ball of tightness right there. I always say to students, what that little alarm system is telling you is let's focus, let's persist, let's plan. This is our body saying we need to do something about this. When we pay attention to those physiological responses, there's a great TED Talk, Kelly McGonigal, and it's called Stress is My Friend. She does a great job of talking through each of those things that happens to our body. And she said, pounding of the heart is just basic biology to say, hey, I'm getting prepared for something. Breathing faster actually brings more oxygen to the brain, which is a good thing. It gets my brain working. We go back to oxytocin, which I'm going to talk about a couple times today, but when our bodies are feeling intense emotions, oxytocin is going to be released because we're humans, and as humans, we are going to crave that physical touch and contact with someone. These are all good things. When our kids come to us and they have these obvious physiological reactions to emotions, don't say, oh my gosh, I need to shut that down, that's uncomfortable for you. Teach them to use those. Your body is getting ready for something. Once they identify it, remind themselves to do it. Yeah.
Sorry, I just have a question that I don't understand the nuance there is when you're saying use that, and then the idea of calming themselves down, being able to say, oh, I'm feeling this and I'm going to do these things that I know help regulate me, where's the balance there? Because is that using the physiological response by saying, okay, I can feel that I'm getting dysregulated, I need to calm down? Or is it supposed to be you're supposed to be doing something else with that before you try to regulate?
Great question. And I'm going to answer part of it now because then we will get into coping and why we need to do that. So to your point, I'm going to argue our bodies need that physiological reaction and they need to work through it. So I am not the scientist out there, but again, back to equilibrium, it's an amazing thing in our bodies. All on its own, it will feel these intense physiological responses. But old school, when we grew up, we would feel that and then it was done. And when it's done, I'm exhausted, my body will get back to that equilibrium and all those things. We will talk about coping and to which point that's important. Here I'm going to say they need to, I think what happens is adults step in and they shut that physiological response off so they never see they get to that other side. And so now every time they remotely feel these physiological responses, they're like, oh no mom, oh no mom, oh no mom. So when I say they need to feel it, let their body, let them live equilibrium. My body on its own is going to work through this emotion. The reason I think it's so important, and we'll visit it again later, is because it's the only way then they can get to that problem solving for themselves. So what happens, parent comes in and says, you are crying, you're visibly upset, oh my gosh, you need to shut that down. And the way we shut that down is we problem solve for them. And so when doing that, we teach them every time they have that physiological response, that's negative, that's bad, no, it's useful for you, it's your body's little alarm saying, wake up, we gotta do something. And two, it's the only way they will get to, okay, I've just unloaded this emotion, I felt it. Now, problem solving, never easy, but simple. Can I change that stressor? And what I always emphasize with problem solving is first and foremost, your kid needs to start to name what those stressors are. And then, my favorite thing is orange square sticky notes, but get your own favorite thing. Write it down. Every kid in my office, I have the sticky note out and I have the pen. Start to name them for me. What are they? When we put a name to those stressors and what's going on, the best thing we do for them is we externalize it. We get it out of their head and their heart, so now their body can relax. Now it's over here, it's out here. Okay, now I can look at that and say, problem solving wise, can we change that stressor? Number one question, can you change that? A lot of the time, our kids can. Great, now we're into the problem solving stage. If they can't, if there's that sticky note that has, for me it would be my dad, on there, I can't change that stressor. I cannot do anything about it. So now I'm only left with that emotion focus. I can only change my reaction to it. And this gets back to those physiological responses. As long as I worked through, and for me this is crying, okay, I worked through that emotion. Nope, I can't change it, but now we can move on from it. Does that make sense? And then we will talk about that coping piece. The magic here is again in that equilibrium piece, but so often our kids cannot move on to that problem solving until they have named it and felt it. And remember that as a parent or a grandparent or someone in their lives. So what if that emotion and that intensity and those feelings linger? What if I'm feeling them every day for most of the day and for over 2 weeks, and they start to affect my ability to be at my job, my kids' ability to go to school, these major life and functions. Now we're talking about mental health. When we talk about mental health, similar to depression and anxiety, I do want to say we need to get rid of mental health. It's a buzzword. It's way too big for our kids. It's vague. It does not help a kid understand really for themselves what they're struggling with. The best analogy I can give you is if you took your kid to the doctor's office because, let's say, they had some runny nose and a fever. That doctor would never, you guys, say to you as a parent or write on a script, your son is struggling with physical health. Think about that for a second. We've gotten in a really bad habit as mental health providers, which I am one of, as parents, as adults, they're struggling with their mental health. That tells us nothing. Medical doctors would never do that to you because what's important there? Symptoms. Symptoms help you diagnose. Another very important piece. Never, when you are at a doctor's office, would they say runny nose, fever, they're suffering from physical illness, and then have a period at that end of that sentence and say, bye, have a nice day. You would never leave a doctor's office with those physical symptoms and physical health struggles. Why do we let ourselves do that with mental health? This one is important to break down because all those symptoms lead us then into that diagnosis. The only reason, medically or mentally, we diagnose is why? Why do we diagnose?
So that you know what to do.
Right, treatment plan. That's the only reason a doctor does a diagnosis. Now I know the treatment plan and here we go. So we need to get back to when that kid walks into my office and says, Mrs. Berg, you don't understand, I have depression. And there's this awkward pause with them where I'm waiting for them to say, and? So that's my role. And what's making you upset today? And what's making you feel stressed today? Don't stop at the disability. There's not a period at the end of I have depression. There's not a period at the end of I have been diagnosed with ADHD. It's I've been diagnosed with ADHD, and today this is my struggle, and this is what I need to do about it. The way I put this into terms, if your kid was climbing some wall and they fell, and you looked at your kid who's screaming out in pain and the bone is sticking out of their leg, what are you going to do? So your kid has clearly broken their leg. What are you going to do? Freak out. I love it. What else are you going to do? Andrew, what are you going to do? Right? So I'm going to call the professionals. And why? Why are you going to call that ambulance or that doctor's office? Why
Can't do anything about it.
Right? This is out of my expertise. I'm going to call a professional because my kid broke their leg and the bone is sticking out there. There is somebody who has been trained in this area who can step in and help. And two, most important thing I say to kids every day, it is treatable. If there is a broken leg, it is treatable, and at the very least, managing those symptoms. Same thing with mental health. Just like that medical model, we've got to get back to what are your symptoms? Fine, I have to diagnose. I get that when I was in private practice. That was part of being reimbursed by those insurance companies, but only for the purpose of that. Now I know what we're going to do about this. Very important is reminding our kids that if they are struggling with depression, anxiety, attention deficit, if there's struggles going on here and they do have that impairment or that disability, one, get them in the hands of the professionals. Two, it is treatable, or at the very least, managing those symptoms. Next up, if that student is really struggling with an impairment or disability, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the adults in their lives being cautious with what we think is support for these young people. So nowadays, a lot of times we call them accommodations. Sometimes it's through a 504, an IEP. It's even become a law now in Illinois in regards to mental health days. I want us to be cautious. Supports, if they're going to do good for your child, who we are saying does have that disability or impairment, keep in mind, disabilities and impairments, if they're there might be a genetic piece there might be environmental piece, 9 times out of 10 it's both of those. Your kid is likely to have these pieces of them the rest of their life. So the most important thing we can do for them is to not remove those opportunities for them to learn how to manage those symptoms. So just like that broken leg, and we say, hey, you're going to go to the doctor and this is treatable, we've got to be mindful that with any kind of supports we put in place, we really need the student to have, or your child to have more practice of what they struggle with. This is where we kind of talk about, and I'm going to just go through a couple of examples. One example would be with a kid who might feel anxious in giving speeches. 10 years ago, we said, great news, you don't have to give a speech. If you are a shy kid, I don't really like group work. Okay, great, you don't have to do group work. Mental health days, state of Illinois says you guys get mental health days. My struggle with that is we know from a therapeutic standpoint, being home in it itself is never a solution for a young person to manage these symptoms. So when we think about how to support our kid, those supports we really need to think through. And there's a great quote I have on my wall at school from a psychiatrist. Accommodation is helpful when it teaches us how to manage symptoms, but not helpful when it reinforces the belief that we cannot cope and must avoid those triggers. So whatever it is our kids are struggling with, it's exposure and practice. Again. Scaffolding. What can we build in so you have more practice of this and not less? One of the things I always say in my office is when a kid comes in and says, well, what if? No what ifs. When? Tell yourself this is going to happen, and we plan and prepare for it versus the fear of what if it happens. For me, just remember, you guys, all emotions are useful. And the Bible reminds us, Ecclesiastes 3:4, there's a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance. All of these emotions are useful for our kids. Next up, we're going to fly through this one because it is a little bit of review. But a few weeks ago, I kind of talked about that technology piece. And I already told you guys, it is not technology itself that I have a concern with. What did I tell you I had a concern with technology? It's not with the device, but what it's replacing. And that's what we're going to kind of go into here. So it's what it's replacing. Andrew kind of brought this up, that communication piece. As a review, and I should say, so research, and this is back to Jean Twenge, does say just 3 hours of technology a day increases that chance of that person reporting higher levels of depression, anxiety, and risk of suicide. Just 3 hours. So putting this into context, I think there's kids out there that have 3 hours of tech time and are okay. And there's kids who have 3 or more hours of tech time and they're not. And it's going to go down to these 3 things. So first up is communication. What do we most talk about with communication? We said is that they have more communication, but less of that face-to-face. And it came down to concerns with, when we think about communication, if research is right, and 80% of it is all the nonverbals, and only 20% of it is the actual words, oh my goodness, no wonder our kids are struggling. They are not getting, it is face-to-face communication through research has been shown to build stronger connections and relationships because of the nonverbal and the touch. It comes down to those things. So all of these pieces, they're missing in their communication. Also, research shows that this is tied to that face-to-face communication with touch is that empathy, insula, that part of our brain, and also that oxytocin. When we're struggling, if our kids are really struggling with something and they reach out to a friend to communicate online, they are not feeding that oxytocin that's been released, and now it leaves them deprived. Rules for communication, and Andrew kind of brought one of them up for me, but the 3 things I tell adolescents: 1, if it's more than 2 sentences, it's not a snap or a text. And that's for us too. If you've got something to say, if it's more than 2 to 3 sentences, it's a phone call, it's FaceTime, or it's face-to-face. A second one, never, ever, ever use technology to share any kind of emotion or feelings, because 20% of the message is what they're getting, just those words, there is no way I can relay how I am feeling about someone with 20% of that message, it being just words. Lastly, never when you can talk face to face. And I love that Andrew brought this one up. More and more and more, we have parents that are saying they text or snap their kid while they're in the same household. Never, ever, ever. If your kid has the ability to talk to you or a friend or someone else, maybe the next passing period or at lunchtime or after school, they should not be snapping and texting. Communication needs to be face to face. Second one, connection.
I disagree about that you can't convey emotions on the text. I just showed Tim the angry guy from the movie in the meet. That's one of my favorite ones to send.
So there was a research study done.
His head is blowing off and there's fire shooting everywhere. It's really cool.
This is true, and it is true. I go into the AP Psych class at PR, and I always talk about, there was a research study done, and how it's probably 3 or 4 years ago, and they took just teenage, high school age kids in America, and they could more accurately say an emotion that someone was feeling based off of an emoji than they could actual real faces. So yes, they feel like they're letting you know how they feel. No, so real. I appreciate it. Connection. What we said about connection a few weeks ago was they have what they would say more relationships. You know, I always made fun of myself. I had 5 good friends growing up. But what we looked at is when we talk about connection, what relationships looked like for us. I was close to the people who I spent the most time with. So it was somebody I was in a sport with, somebody who was in my neighborhood, or someone who I had classes with. The only reason we were close was because of all of the amount of time we spent together. What they're saying about our kids' relationships, if they are stuck in the shallow end of relationships, they aren't getting this in depth. So when you're struggling in your life and you guys think about who you would reach out to, probably a spouse, probably a best friend, maybe someone in your family, you have that relationship there when you're going to get together for coffee or go on a walk and we're going to talk about this. Our kids, when they're feeling sad, anxious, any of these emotions that feel uncomfortable, they are reaching out through technology to try to connect with that person, and it's not fulfilling because, again, back to that oxytocin. Biologically, it is not fulfilling what that need is there. They're more lonely because they're actually using that tech to connect, and the connection piece isn't there, so now they're actually more disconnected. So how can we help them with this? This was back to a few weeks ago. We talked about sports, activities, job, volunteering. How can we get our kids with other kids more, and not when they can be on their devices? And in our households, do we have spaces where kids can come over to our house and be with our kids? What does our time look like as far as building in time with our kids on a daily basis to build those connections? The last one is coping, and Angela kind of hinted there, and so we'll talk a little more about this one. This one is really important to me because when we think about coping, their use of technology is kind of hurting them in 2 different ways. And in general, I think somebody said searching for other means. Yeah. What's happening is they are using technology in a way, it's almost like I would say they're using an external source to help them self-regulate versus looking inwardly to how to self-regulate. And what's important here is when you look at how they're using technology, one, they're doing that passive, where I'm just going to scroll. I'm going to take this instant vacation for a little bit, and I want to leave my problem, and I'm going to scroll through YouTube or watch these videos. I'm okay with that for a second if I need that instant vacation. But what they're finding is adolescents are doing 2 things. One, they're not going back to their program. So I call this the big build. So I'm having a problem, I'm going to go over here and be passive, and I'm not going to go back and address that problem, and now it's just building in there and building and building and building. The second thing is when we reach out through technology to find social support. So back to these, hey, I want to let my best friend know that I'm feeling awful right now. Great, my best friend writes back within a few seconds, and they say, don't worry, Mrs. Berg, I care about you, and I get this lovely dopamine hit. How long does that feel-good response last in me?
A few minutes, right? 5-10 minutes.
Right? At the most, I would say. So, woohoo, somebody cares about me. And then it's gone, and it's back to this. We're using the technology in this external source way in an area where I need to be able to do this within myself. So when we think about coping, let me ask you this. What's the difference between coping and support?
individual versus group?
So coping is my work to do, right? Coping is when I bring my body back to equilibrium. Support in general is when I rely on someone else. And they're both important for different reasons, and we'll go more into that support role when we talk about parents. But when we talk about coping, when my body is feeling uncomfortable and I am passively and then I don't go back to my problem, it builds. But when I use technology and I'm trying to get connection through somebody else and they give me this little, woohoo, I care about you, it's almost what I would call false assurance, because it's not me feeling that way. I'm relying on someone's words to make me feel that way. And then it's only 20% because it's back through that technology piece. What's important here is, and this is for families too, when our kids reach out and they say, I'm struggling today, Mom, and then you respond with, I'm so sorry you're going through that, I'll come and pick you up. What we're doing for our kids is we're not letting them, when we go back a few screens, really feel that emotion. We're sending them the message that emotion is negative and uncomfortable and you should avoid it, versus letting them feel it. If your kid is struggling, I'm going to tell you the easiest rule: do not communicate with your kid during the day. If they are in a daycare or school environment, this is their best opportunity to feel their emotion, identify that emotion, and what I call build multiple circles of support. If you keep that lifeline alive, all you're telling your kid is, sorry, you can't do it without me, kiddo, and that these things are negative. And remember, they're positive. They need these. If they're using those external sources, they're never going to learn how to respond to those physiological responses and kind of work through that. So much of what I'm going to argue is that mental health crisis right now is actually our kids struggling with how to cope rather than the actual symptoms. What is coping? I'm going to go back to that medical model really quick. When we think about coping, the medical model, if you guys are going to take care of yourself healthy-wise, what do? What are the important things to take care of your physical health? Exercise. And those, I'm going to argue, are the preventative, right? So physical health has two pieces to it. One, I'm going to have these preventative, what I like to say protective habits. And if I am sick or broke my leg, there's also this reactive one, where now I'm going to go take medicine, get surgery, get the cast, whatever it is. Same thing with mental health. We got in a bad habit of talking about the reactive and stopped talking about that proactive, preventative, protective factors. In our day-to-day lives, build those in. Be very transparent and tell your kids what yours are. I know mine is running and working out. That is a big one for me. I still like to journal. I love my sticky notes. Is it listening to music? What are the things you build in? And I don't even love the word coping strategies anymore. I like breaking it down into what are my preventative, protective daily habits. Have a couple of those. Where we are teaching our kids every day they need those. That's how they regulate their bodies. Then, when life throws them a hoop, and now those emotions are causing these stronger physiological responses, now it's important too to say, what are those other ones? So preventative, just like physical health, is certainly going to be working out, journaling, music. You guys probably have some of your own. But then when that stressor happens and I'm feeling that emotion and my body kicks in, it's also having those go-to of how do I, back to your question, Angela, kind of help my body and feel its intensity. There, breathing, grounding techniques, and in the here and now, especially with anxiety. You guys out there, who's got good preventative, protective, and who's got some good in the moment? What you got? You know, Kelly working out. What else?
Sleep.
Sleep?
Is really big.
Yes, which is another thing our kids are not getting. Which is another. Any other ones? What do you guys do on a day-to-day basis to kind of take care of yourself and keep those emotions?
Vent.
Yeah. And sometimes just that release. You know, a big line I always say, I don't need you to solve it, I just need you to listen. I just need to vent and get it out. Any other ones? I know time's sake, I'm going to keep going, but this is important for you guys when you kind of take something away. I always like homework of the practice. Think about what yours are and start to verbalize, make those obvious for your kids of what your preventative, protective factors are. But then, hey, in this moment, I'm having a really bad day. This is something that really helps me, so that becomes part of that everyday vocabulary. Just to remind you, another verse from the Bible that I think helps us here is, for our kids to be able to manage their emotions, if it has turned into more of an impairment and a struggle, to use the way they communicate, connect, and cope face-to-face and internally versus externally. The Bible, Philippians 4:13 says, I could do all things, even those hard things, through Christ who strengthens me. We need to believe that, but we need to make sure that our kids understand that too. It's not that mental health or depression or anxiety or these emotions are to be avoided, they are to be used. Last one here is parenting. As a parent, what do you struggle with the most? What do you most worry about or fear in life?
That your child is not going to be a productive, confident contributor to society and lead a godly life.
And I love, Joel, it's to do with my child, right? So often I think as parents or grandparents or these adults in kids' lives, it's so much about my child. Well, a research study was done, and they said on average, we worry 37 hours a week about our kids. That's almost a full-time job. So, with this one, what concerns me is not even just our own health, that cortisol level, and what worrying does, but research is showing that us worrying about our kids is actually negatively affecting our kids. How so? Couple things here. I would not tell you to read this whole book, The Coddling of the American Mind, but the first chapter is amazing. But in this book, he kind of talks about when we worry about our kids, and so this one does too, but when we worry about our kids, we teach them the world is unsafe. Crazy as this might be, still statistically, we live in a physically more safe world than used to be. Doesn't feel like it because of all the media and social media. But two, and this is kind of more of the important part that she talks about, is so what if it was more unsafe? Who do we want to raise? We want to raise a survivor, a fighter, someone who's willing to be okay in life, especially when they leave our house. We'll know they're okay. Like Joel kind of expanding to, they will become this citizen, all of these different things. So when we worry about our kids and we say the world's unsafe, that teaches them, oh my goodness, I'm scared, I need help here, I can't handle this on my own. But second, and this is important, it teaches our kids that we think we're in control there. Back to one of the other resources, and it is over here that Laura gave us. The title was Planning Funerals That Will Never Happen, or That Won't Happen Today. And in it, the woman kind of reflects in this moment, and she says, quote unquote, we carry the pressure that ultimately everything rises and falls on whether or not we can control things. Stop and think about that. Who's in control? Us? No, right? We are not in control, and as parents, we've got to remember this. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast your anxiety onto him. This is a good reminder, and I kind of want to talk about when we worry about our kids, humble yourself. There's 3 things we need to do as the adults in our kids' lives. 1, our kids are anti-fragile. I want you to say that in your head for a second. Get in the whole first chapter on this. We treat our kids like they're fragile. And if you think about this, struggle, concerns, things that happen in their lives, stress. 1, it's inevitable. It's coming whether we want it to or not. 2, yeah.
One of the things that I just wanted to throw out is that, the one thing I think is important to keep in mind is that you need to be able to allow your children to know that it is a natural thing to have these emotions. You said useful, and this anti-fragile I think is really important is that they need to know it's okay to have anger, it's okay to have joy, it's okay to be disgusted, it's okay. Now, what do we need to do, to help them adapt and grow from that? And a lot of times it's when we don't allow them to know it's okay to have those. There are 6 hardwired emotions that we have that God's given to us. And those are the things that we need to be able to help them understand. It's okay because that's a natural part of what you do. that's what you're saying, I think, with that. But I think sometimes we forget to let them know it's okay.
And almost, it's like to your point, there's a reason they're in us. You know, there's a reason God gave us these emotions to feel. Absolutely. Here, when we talk about, so they're not fragile. So when they have these struggles, one of the sentences I always use with kids is, all it does is it creates condition for you to learn, to adapt, to grow. Real quick, when we think about nature, that plant that has none of the elements that are exposed withers and dies. They need those elements to be stronger. When you think about physical health, if you have an injury and you're in a cast and you can't use your leg, 6 weeks later when that cast comes off, what happened? Muscle atrophy. When we don't use these things, they actually do what the opposite of what we want. They're not preparing them to learn and grow and adapt. Our kids need mental challenges, struggles in life, just like those physical challenges, in order to grow and develop. Second one, beware of that negative feedback loop. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the supports. What happens, anybody know a little bit, and I'm going to tell just because I know I'm going to run out of time here. Peanut allergies. What they found was this huge growth in peanut allergies really came from the fact that I love that you're giggling, really came from the fact that we stopped exposing kids to peanuts, so the cure became part of what caused the problem. Same thing here, when we don't let our kids struggle and feel, one, be exposed to these things that are happening, but two, then feel those emotions, all we do is create this negative feedback loop. We've got to step out of the way and allow this exposure and practice, and I'm going to argue, allow this exposure and practice in small doses while they are in the most supportive environment they will ever be. Your households, our schools, let them feel these things while we can still support them. The Coddling of the American Mind, just a quick quote from him. A culture that allows concept of safety to creep so far that it equates emotional discomfort with physical danger is a culture that encourages people to systematically protect one another from the very experiences embedded in daily life that they need in order to become healthy. Stop omitting the things from happening. Be in it with them. Your job is not to protect. Allowing that exposure and practice, again, in those small doses, in our environments, in our schools, where they have all that support, is the best time for that exposure. Lastly, help them build competence and confidence. And I'm so glad you kind of alluded to this, because this is probably the one I believe the most in. Think of when you are most confident in your life. And I would love a discussion here, but I got to keep moving. Think about that. The only reason you're confident in that is through, I'm going to argue, exposure and practice and doing it again and again and again and again, getting that feedback along the way. Well, we can't speed up confidence. Confidence, and I love that Joel used, I want my kid to be confident, threw it in there. You can't hope that for your kid, but you can step out of the way and allow your kid to get there through that exposure and practice. There was a research study done where they took kids and they had the parent with them and they were on a little computer program, and they said, parents, do not help your kid. Gave them a really tough problem, and the kid was to work through that. And what they found is the parents that stepped in, because the kid is struggling and they're complaining and I can't do it, and the parents who stepped in, the good news for the parent, their anxiety went down. But what do you think happened to the kids? Went up, right? Because we did two things. We told our kid, sorry, you can't do it without me, you need my help, which is the worst thing we can do for our kid. And we robbed them of the opportunity to work through that, to persist, and all of the things we know that go into that problem solving to figure that out. Or, even Andrew and I were talking a little bit before, or struggle and fail. Two of the concepts I most love are what I call growth-producing events, kind of what you were talking about. These things need to happen to them, and successful failures. Divorce, death, breakup, not making the team, failing tests, all of these things that happen to our kids, don't omit them from your kid. Be in it with them, keeping in mind that exposure and practice is how they will develop that confidence that when they go off at 18, they're going to be able to do this. Real quick, I always break it down into 4 with, watch, and independent. Every skill your kid will ever learn will go through these 4 stages. So let's just say crossing the street. When they're a baby and they can't walk, you're going to do it for them. And you hold your baby and you walk across the street. Then, hopefully by 1 or 2, they're walking. And now I'm going to do it with you. We're going to hold hands and we're going to walk across the street. By 5, they're getting on that bus to go to kindergarten. I hope you're standing on the front stoop and you're just talking to them. You're going to watch them, but you're going to give them a heck of a lot of feedback. Whoa, 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 Kelly, you didn't look to the left. Look to the right, here comes the car, whoa, come back, and you're talking and giving that feedback. Hopefully, our kids are high school age, they can cross the street on their own by that age. Some of them can't. But for with, watch, and independent is the most important thing you can give your kids. That's how they're going to build. For most of our kids, we're really in the watch and independent far sooner than most of our parenting skills allow. When we do this, really important here is our role is not to fix, protect, avoid. Our role is to be in it with them and to support. I just want to leave with what support really is. Support, you got to remember, is not taking that emotion from them, and it is not stepping in and fixing it for them. Support has 3 parts. Support is listening, and in the words of my 19-year-old, listening without getting involved. Listening with the intent of understanding. You're just listening to them. 2, validate that emotion. Get back to that's real for you. And I love all of these are important and useful and name it. What is it? Yep, that's real. And then the 3rd thing is ask open-ended questions. Don't solve it for them. So when you are supporting your kid and you're really allowing this exposure and practice, listen with the intent of understanding, validate that emotion, help them name it, and then lastly, what would help? What did you try last time? What do you want to try? That's your role in that support. Last Bible verse for you here. Remind yourself you are not in control. One of the best things we can remind our kids, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And the best thing we can remind ourselves is humble yourselves. Therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. We are not the ones in control. I know I need to turn it over to Don for a couple of seconds.
Question for a couple of minutes at 10:30 also.
You sure? Okay. So I said a lot. Again, I was hoping for more time. Yes.
So I don't know if you have these stats, but I would be very curious to know what the difference is in young adults and teens in Christian homes, not just like, yeah, I believe in God, but like actual relationship with God versus society. If there's any, if they're equal in the amount of like depression and suicide rates, or if the ones that have God to turn to are far less. Do you have any of those stats?
And I don't know, Don, if you do. I would be happy to kind of look into that. I think the nature of, I was a mental health provider and crisis work in private practice, then I went into a public school, so most of the research I read is kind of for all, not specific, but I can look into that.
So, and then like, part of the reason I was asking that is because I feel like a lot of, like, these are all really great, but I feel like some of them are only Band-Aids to the real problem, and they're really, God is needing to fill many of these voids. I know that you can have God and still have these problems, but I would not want to deal with it without him personally. And so I just kind of wanted to know where God fits into all this, and I would add prayer to that list of things that you can do with and for your children.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and praying with them just as much as praying for them.
Right, that 37 hours thing, like so much of that, like for me, is in prayer. And then I think it's less than that because that you are casting it to God, and it's not so much my problem anymore, but his.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, give grace to yourself as a parent as well. I mean, all of this is what you're supposed to do. We have adult children. Make sure you do this. Make sure we still have anxiety too. My son getting on a plane at 20 years old right now, and I'm nervous. You know, I mean, he's going to LA by himself. I've got anxiety. He's an adult, but it's still normal, and it's okay. But everything that I, we're talking about what we do for others, make sure we're doing for ourselves as well. And we have to make sure that we step back and say, it's normal that I'm a little nervous about this or that, and step back for yourself before you go to your child. I guess what you got to take time for you to step back.
And the most important reason is for yourself, and because they're watching you. You're modeling for them how to handle these emotions and what they do. Absolutely. Do you have one thing?
Just a couple comments. A, to answer, just to add to your comment about, the Christian versus secular statistics related to depression, anxiety in teenagers. Ultimately, from what I've read, I haven't seen any actual stats. They're going to be fundamentally skewed because, especially in the evangelical churches, most parents tend to throw that stuff under the rug. very, very strongly. And I've seen comments and I'm like, oh my word, good job with your eyes closed. Secondly, I just wanted to make a point, and Missy, I'm sure you agree with me. Everything you said today was great, but this probably applies for kids who are maybe learning to deal with their emotions and things like that. If you have a kid who's truly diagnosed with depression, anxiety, ADHD, things like that, it's going to be a vastly different ballgame.
I think though,
I mean, the fundamentals are there, but it's.
I think for my day, I so often am dealing with those, and that's why I think these pieces are important, because I am going to say in research is supporting it is the inability to cope with these things that is actually the bigger problem than the diagnosis in itself.
Right, but you know, if you have a kid whose anxiety is completely off the rails, like you're not going to be able just to talk them down from it and say, okay, just like, you know,
No, but I
walk
think
your
they-
way through it
yes.
and it'll be fine. You can't, you know.
The power with anxiety is in all of us. And for you as an individual, twofold. One, what is it today? Because different causes lead it, even if it's biologically in us. And two, for today with what's going on, how can we help you? Yeah. Monica, go Monica, go.
Okay, I just want to put it out there. I'm feeling really convicted. Hi, I'm Monica Walden. You may recognize this face from PBS or children's messages. I love Jesus to my core. I am a Jesus girl. Lived in a very loving Christian environment. I'm diagnosed with anxiety and depression and a plethora of other things. And the big guy and I, we are besties, but in order for him to use me, I needed to be medicated. I needed the regular therapy sessions. So if you and your child have any issues, I would be happy to discuss them.
But I think, Monica, you were great at the beginning, too. You acknowledge there are professionals out there that can help. And I think a big piece of that is it is manageable. It is treatable. And that's the most important message we can give people who are struggling.
It's not easy. It's not easy.
No. No.
We are out of time. And the bad news is that the 37 hours for worrying only goes up when you have grandkids. Right? All the grandparents are nodding their heads. So sorry, it doesn't get any better. So a couple of announcements, and then we got to go get our kids from Sunday school. Missy will close her in a second. So we are taking a 4-week break. Next week is the cantata during the 9:30 hour. So there's no Sunday school, adult education. So next week is cantata, and the Sunday school programs the week after that. That's Christmas. We resume January 8th. We are now going to move into some series that are going to go along with what Pastor Keeman is going to be preaching on. So our small group is going to be through the Bible. That's what is going to be his sermon series. And then here at Mid-Pointe, we're going to answer objections that come up about the Bible on a regular basis. You know, if you have any interaction with people who are not followers of Christ, they're going to say the Bible is written by a bunch of people. What we possess today is not what was originally written. It's not really the inspired word of God. There are mistakes in it. We're going to spend 8 weeks really trying to address those. And Missy, myself, Laura Gilliland, everybody who has spoken, we're all going to be part of that series, and then a 4-week series leading up to Easter. And then we're going to actually do the Chosen series too after Easter, and then I'll carry us into the summer. So we will resume January 8th and continue on. Thank you all for being a part of this. And we'll see you close this.
Thank you guys so much for the discussion. I wish there was more of it. So, thank you, God. You guys can close in prayer with me. Thank you, God, for giving us this hour and being with us as we talk about a very tough topic. Please help us to use the conversations and resources we talked about over the past 8 weeks to guard our hearts and strengthen our relationship with each other and most of all with you. Amen. Thanks, guys.